Okay, and now we start with Heidegger. Heidegger wrote a classic work, which is what we're doing will be based upon. There's an earlier and a later Heidegger, but we're going to be working with the Heidegger that Gadamer and Levinas mainly worked with, which is Being in Time, in particular this volume. It came out in two editions, two translators. And if you're really interested in digging down into both these editions are good. They both have different strengths and weaknesses. So if you're really going to get into Heidegger, you can consult both of them. A good secondary resource is in the recommended readings. Safransky's Martin Heidegger, Between Good and Evil. It's really an excellent book, which is, interestingly enough, it's a product of our understanding that has come through hermeneutics, which dissolves what was a classic distinction between philosophy and history, where we would do philosophy and we would kind of know when the figure came from and how they related to other philosophers and their ideas, but we didn't relate the philosophies directly as philosophically significant to current events, to current historical events. Safransky does a great job in relating the two, the Heidegger's philosophy and how it's related to what's going on in the world that Heidegger is working in. And this will be the stream of future work now, because of what we're going to talk about here, the way in which we find ourselves thrown already into finite context. So that place of abstract universal reasoning, which grounded this strong distinction between when you're doing philosophy and when you're doing history, that's collapsed. And so now thought has to be understood in its historical context. Another good introduction, Richard Polt, Heidegger, an introduction. And I also recommend that to you. And then my book, if you want to know the direction I'm using Heidegger, how I use him on the way to Levinas, and especially in terms of recovery of the reality of agape, which for me is at the heart of faith, is surrender to agape, being seized by agape for every face. Chapter 6, I think it is. No, chapter 5 of A Reasonable Belief is where I do some work on Heidegger and attempt to do it in ordinary language. The first draft of that chapter I handed to my editor. I used all the Heideggerian technical jargon, some of which we have here, and he just sent it back to me and said, write it over. And so, but it was a good exercise to put Heidegger into ordinary language. I should also stress that mine is not an Anglophone reading of Heidegger, which tends to be, in my opinion, reductionistic. I had one critic of the book just say that my reading of Heidegger was odd. No content at all to the criticism, which was a bit frustrating, but it is odd in the typical Anglophone reductionistic reading of Heidegger, which has to read Heidegger pretty much within the bounds of a metaphysical naturalism, which is precisely what he is exploding. So it is odd in that sense. I also think it's correct, and it's not odd in continental interpretations of Heidegger. I don't believe. All right. That said, let's get into the categories we're looking at, and starting with the forgotten question of being, which really maybe this should be better read as the forgotten question of the being of being, and or of the sort of being that has being. So let me do this in terms of the videos or the stick figures. So we made progress here, right? We started out with Schleiermacher, and it was kind of X here goes to a book, or all the textuality, everything here, and then you look at the book, and the idea is to get that same thought, which produces the discourse back here. And what we realized is that Schleiermacher's theory, by the way, I say palimpsest because I don't want to lose in the end Schleiermacher. I think there are insights to each of these people. So as we build and move beyond each figure, when I say that I want to see these as layers in a palimpsest, I don't want to lose Heidegger. I don't want to lose his concern for the author. which tends to get lost later for good reasons. So I want to integrate those reasons, but still, I don't think these are mutually exclusive understandings hermeneutically. I mean, I think let me not go into that now. We can pursue that later, perhaps. But anyway, what we realize is that was radically untheorized, that this X is not simply something magically created by this person that has a meaning that goes here, but actually the reason this X has meaning, the reason this person can think in terms of this X, is because the X is out here. It's part of a common lexicon of linguality, let's say, of that which is the product of human intentionality. And this would be most precisely and obviously language, but it would also be customs, gestures, turns of phrase, clothing, fashion, and mores, cultural traditions, everything which is kind of understood or is as a product of understanding in cultural forms, monuments, statues, art, all of that sort of stuff, not simply language, but everything that has a linguistic character, which exists in the realm of understanding. And so we fleshed this out. We realized that this paper itself actually can be seen as that lingual sphere. In other words, these two figures are not actually, you don't have actually a figure here and then a book and a figure here and this book kind of going across. Everything, all linguisticality is going across. And of course, this text is in here and makes its way in particular streams here. But in some ways, this text is affected by every other text on Earth, all other linguisticality on Earth, unless we're talking about a day before we're a global village, when oceans or mountain ranges absolutely maybe separated sets of people, but nowadays, when everything is connected to some degree across society, what you've got is this vast range of customs and languages and turns of phrases carried in all sorts of texts and paintings and art and mannerisms, memes that is one way this is often named, sculptures, all those sorts of things are carried, and then you understand yourself, you find yourself thrown here, this person's thrown here, and they come to be and they understand themselves in terms of this. So we have we go from this kind of basic Schleiermachian diagram, which is these two figures in a text, which we come to realize, well, there's a lot not interrogated in that diagram, but in particular, everything which we now recognize as the sheet of paper on the diagram. And in a sense, what Heidegger realizes is the other thing that we have not yet interrogated on this diagram is the most interesting and complex element of it all, which is these figures themselves. What in the world are they? And why is it that we're highlighting them? Why could it be that with Schleiermacher we could think just in terms of these two figures, not just in terms of all the linguisticality of the text? Well, it's because they are a different sort of being amidst being. And just for the sake of argument, I mean, Heidegger is completely anthropocentric, and for the sake of argument, I'm going to remain completely anthropocentric. But there's no way, especially in light of what we know about evolution, not to think that it's not just humans, but all sorts of beings on a hierarchy that have evolved out. Somehow the capacity for being in this way is intrinsic to the ultimate structure of reality, but it necessitates evidently certain levels of organized complexity, which only emerge over time. So we start here with the Big Bang, and we just have everything that happens, and eventually these sorts of we emerge eventually, but a lot emerges before us with more simplistic levels of understanding. Who knows what might emerge, in the future? But that's not for us to worry about now. But at any rate, this is a different sort of being, and that's the sort of being that's forgotten. That's precisely the who, that the what. And when we try to make a science of the historical, or that we do the social sciences, which work in accord with the rules of the natural sciences, which are part of that sphere of nature, which is this flow right here, this flux, this total flux is understood to progress with a causal necessity. Whatever happens here is a product of some confluence of prior causes, and really this is the abstraction, right? There's no point that's outside of time. That's the sense in which I was saying the A doesn't equal A. That's taking seriously the fact that the flux is constantly moving. The U that exists now is ever so slightly, but really different than the U that it suggested. U I mentioned at the beginning of this sentence. We're in constant flux and change, and to isolate that U in a certain way is an abstraction, but there's a good reason to do it, because it seems like all awareness, all human understanding, takes place from some point or another in this flux. I might be able to isolate, say, a mountain, but the mountain doesn't isolate the mountain. And if there's not me with my particular ways of human ways of being in interaction with the world, right? Then maybe there would be no mountain. That's completely artificial to pull the mountain out. We've decided on the qualities that will do that, and if we're doing a political map, then we don't see the mountains. If we're doing a map which is looking at geographical features, then we do see the mountains. If we're looking at the world using only electromagnetic waves, maybe the mountains don't show up in the same way. The difference is where there's areas that are discrete in different senses come up according to how you're measuring. But what doesn't seem, you don't have those sorts of options where you can't think in those ways as kind of a contingent isolation of something when it comes to these sorts of beings, which actually are from what you see. Again, so the mountain doesn't see, but somehow here in this flux we get confluence, and again we remain anthropocentric here at certain points, and these points are these figures, are us, right? So there's a sense that at some point there's a level of complexity at which I look up, I see red, I say red, and I have an understanding of seeing and saying red. Now, at some point level of complexity, then we have these other things, dashboard cameras in our cars. And those cameras, too, can see red. Particularly, they can see stop signs. And they can see a stop sign and say to you, stop. And in the physical sense and in the mechanical sense, just like the waves hit your eye, go to your brain, all these categories work. There's a physical dimension to all of this, and I see the red stop sign and I say stop, and my phone, the eye of my phone sees it, and it does the same thing, waves to its brain, make all the connections, and it says stop. Right? There's a way in which everything that we can see, actually, like everything you see when you see me, or if you were to take me apart and look at all those interactions, would be akin to what's going on in the camera. In that sense, we both see the red stop sign. However, there also seems to be clearly a sense in which I am aware of seeing the sign. I am seeing comprehendingly, or with understanding, with a perspective, with intentionality. I have an awareness, a consciousness of the scene, which the smartphone or my dashboard cam clearly does not have, especially at its level of simplicity. Right? Now there's nothing special about carbon. In theory, we could get a complex enough non-carbon-based entity, a silicon-based entity, which may well say, well, no, I see it too. I know just what you're talking about. So there's, we are physical, we're machines. I'm not positing some magical stuff. What I'm saying is the languages we associate with nature, in the sense of the natural sciences, in the sense of stuff, in the materialistic sense, that way of understanding the world is not sufficient to describe the character of me being conscious of seeing red. So the qualia, not just the redness, but what's called the qualia, the awareness of the redness. So that is the forgotten question of being. What is the character of this entity, which is, and this is where he uses a language of clearing. Somehow this is not just a continuation within the flux. This represents an opening in the flux from which things are seen, even as it is a part of a flux and itself a product of it and moving on. But we need this other vocabulary, vocabulary of consciousness, vocabulary of understanding, of the sort of thing that understands. In other words, we've been doing this theory of interpretation of hermeneutics, and we've been doing it looking for what's the objective meaning of this. And as we saw Schleiermacher, the more we are out here getting how this, is a common meaning, it's shared, the more we get into us insofar as we are simply products, right? Not discrete, not different in kind. And Heidegger says we forget that the question of interpretation can forget what sort of thing is an interpreter. What's the sort of thing that exists in understanding? All right, so that is just, again, of course, riffing here on Heidegger, the forgotten question of being, or the forgotten question of the being of being. In my book, you'll see I relate this to time and being very precisely because, unless you simply have raw flux, right, with no consciousness, which means that any isolation on this doesn't happen, right? To have even a notion of time, not as t in an equation, but time as temporality, the thing that t measures. What is that? What is it that t as time measures? What is the temporality? And it turns out that what you need to have temporality is something which can distinguish 2 points in the flux and then distinguish between them and label these as a now before and a now after and have a sense of the gap as time. In other words, if there's no sentience, there's no time. Right? It's not to say there's not raw flux, but time is not just the raw flux. Time is a perception of the flux from a before and an after, from the two nows, where the now is the moment which is ever vanishing. It has no extension. It's the moving point with no extension into a future which is not yet, and from a past which is no longer, but in a present which is a point without extension. Right, so that's where we live, where we are this clearing. And so not only is there no time, because we're just talking about marking out a distance and then a defined between, there'd be no space either, because space too requires you to have a here and a there and a conceivable of in between. That it takes a different sort of entity to do that, and that's what he means by Dasein. It's just their being. He's trying to name the opening, the appearance in being of this most fundamental reality, which we are, but to name it just in the raw sense of somehow amidst all this flux, at various points, emerge a clearing, right? This opening, this da being. Da is there, sein is the German for the being, right? And again, it's important to keep the verbal sense of this, right? So Dasein is just their being. Somehow in this flux, throughout in all sorts of points, there emerges Dasein. Maybe other sorts of Dasein in other places. And again, to some degree, all sorts of other creatures are also Dasein. But again, I'm going to stay anthropocentric as Heidegger does, as Levinas does, but as is clearly inadequate given the fact that we have evolved from, there's no sense to think that suddenly all these capacities emerge just with us, right? So we would need to consistent with evolutionary understand how we've evolved out. But nonetheless, this is still a great thing, because this is giving substance to the question of the who, and realizing this is not just some sort of I don't want to lose my who, I don't want to lose my who-ness, my individuality, I don't want to disappear into this flux. It's not just that sort of an issue. It's an issue of the ability to comprehend the character of the sort of being that exists in understanding. And that's what Dasein is, which is what takes us here to our second line. That's where the da is there and the sein is being. The being there, right? The being there that we are. So the forgotten question of being is the question that insofar as we do the sciences, the natural sciences and the social sciences, this is where, in a way, in vocabulary we use later, there's a systemic distortion here insofar as both of these are sciences, right? And whereas what Dilthey wants is a sphere for spirit, which is a different sort of a thing. This Dasein is a way of giving concrete meaning, not magical, ghostly stuff, but concrete meaning to what we mean when we say spirit, to distinguish spirit from things, right? That's how this gives us something concrete and meaningful, to make that sort of a distinction. And so the being of some beings that emerge in reality. And that's why time and being is so significant, because the very recognition of time as such, right, the temporality, the seeing of time, presumes a sort of entity which is not simply part of the flux. So something which is in principle not visible to anyone who's thinking in a naturalistic way, or just in terms of a metaphysical materialism. This is not to undercut a methodological materialism. So this is to affirm still the natural sciences and the social sciences, and to see them as being very accurate in what they say about us. It's not a matter of the accuracy of modern science. It's a question of whether it is exhaustive in its explanatory potential. And what Heidegger does, and what makes being and time the signal work that it is, the signal work that it is that he identified this different sort of being among being. And this is where the natural sciences, the materialism, has to deal with the ontic, and Dasein has to do with ontic, which is also ontological, which is as this other sort of existence, also in the sphere of understanding. Now, Ricoeur says only in understanding, which is a mistake, and tends to create us as just mental beings, and not as fully embodied physical beings. And so that is a bit of a systemic distortion that also permeates all of this, insofar as we think of all understanding as linguistic in a sophisticated sense, thereby eliminating from the view of hermeneutics, insofar as hermeneutics is thought to focus only on language, let alone only on text, again, to without warrant and without notice, to engage a systemic distortion, which excludes from possible consideration all beings which don't read texts, which don't have this sort of linguistic dimension. It's especially ironic that that happens here, because as Heidegger is going to unpack understanding in terms of situation, understanding, and interpretation, which we have here, situation is something we share with a tree, as we'll see, or a scallop or something like that. Understanding is something we probably share also with dolphins and horses and dogs. Not probably, surely. Understanding, because this is a pre-linguistic sort of just knowing your way around the world, something more than a situation. There's some intentionality, some comprehension here, but then an interpretation is where we get to the level of textuality and thinking in terms of text, and having language to reflect in. Right, so but I just got ahead of myself. Let me go back. So the Dasein is the being there, and maybe even that should be like that, right? And so the flux that we're looking at in our thing, that's being, but the emergence of entities which are aware of their being, right, and have a sense of being, a sense of time, a sense of space, that is the emergence within being of being. Of the sorts of beings that be. Now, consistent with Dilthey, let me give it the projection. There's also a sense here, this opens up space for some sense of self-determination, in the sense of free will or creative self-determination. That's the sense of projection. Right? So it's a projection forward. We anticipate a future, and this future is not just something we might do differently. It's actually a part of our understanding, right? And it impacts my present in ways that may not always be obvious. So let me say this. So right now, so this morning I got scans, right, to check for whether there's any recurrence of cancer, and everything looks great. However, if things had not looked great, and and when you go back for these tests, even when the news is supposed to be good, there's a sense in which the question is raised, right? So the question of your near future and what the projection, what the future you're imagining is open to question. If you get a diagnosis and suddenly that future is weeks or months, then the way in which you're kind of thinking of your future is extending, really without end in any functional sense. How that has affected how you're in the present becomes visible, right? And it's not that yesterday when I wasn't thinking about this so much, that the future didn't matter to me. It's not that right now, if you're not in a parallel situation like this, it doesn't matter to you. It's just it's not noticeable to you, right? If we were to find out, we were to spot some sort of a meteor that was the size of a continent and was going to hit the Earth and wipe out all life with nothing we can do about it. We have 3 weeks. Suddenly, the way in which right now we don't think we all have just 3 weeks, but have a lot more time, how that is a part of affecting our current understanding at a very fundamental layer, at the level of situation, understanding, and interpretation, or at least the level of understanding and interpretation. It's a fundamental shift. The way in which we don't have that expectation is playing a role in our present, even though we're not thinking about it. It only becomes noticeable when we think about it. And this will be significant with Heidegger because he thinks that understanding that each Dasein has a beginning and an end, and having that firmly in mind, and having in particular your own end in mind, which will only be yours, even if it's shared with others. It's your end, and for him that's something that awakens you to the potentialities of your present. All right, so I'm throwing a lot of different Heidegger stuff at you at once, but that's the sense in which we're a projection. So we're a projection, one in the sense that we can kind of anticipate a future and determine among possible futures, move, even though we're largely determined by our social and natural conditioning, there's still space for us to imagine and hence to move to some degree amongst different futures. And there's also the ways in which our imagining of the future already is a part of our present. So that's the way in which there's a projection, but it's a projection within a prior being thrown. And that's the sense in which we all emerge. And you can take quite literally here in terms of Dasein is something which is conceived and born. So we come into awareness quite literally. We come into awareness here or there in this culture with this set of linguistic possibilities that give us our own identity, through which we interpret who we are and what we can be and what's significant, or there we emerge in another time, another place, another set of identities. And this is what I've talked about now repeatedly in terms of who I am, and this is where we played with the meaning of saying would be very different if I emerged with different physical characteristics. Let's say I'm a cisgendered woman in 7th century Tibet versus a cisgendered male in 21st century United States. Just all those variations. Just because of where I happen to have emerged, what I take as significant, how I fundamentally identify myself, what my faith tradition possibilities are, all those sorts of things I find myself thrown into. But I'm not dictated by that. That gives me massive parameters. It's kind of like I'm caught in the Gulf current in the stream of history, and even if you're caught within the Gulf current, you're going to flow with the Gulf current. But you can swim around here and there a little bit. So there's a thrownness, which is the contingency of then our understanding, our self-understanding, our givenness. There is that thrownness. And that's very much what Dilthey saw. That Dilthey unfolds. We can understand that very much in Diltheyan terms. But there's also this projection. This Dilthey did not kind of do. There's not this temporality in Dilthey in the same way, because he's looking just for the objective. But in fact, we're temporal. And so we're thrownness, but we project a future, and we can either surrender and just follow the herd, and never realize our own most possibilities, We can just do what we've always been expected to do, just live into the dominant modes of understanding. We can do that, which Heidegger would see as inauthentic existence, a form of lostness, of not having, I'll use Rorty here, not having seized the potential to become the I that I could be, and instead just living out these trajectories. That we can go that way, perhaps have a quite happy life that way, but it would be a life that in that sense would be seen as inauthentic, not one that we have seized and made our own. So that gives you some sense of what Dasein is and how it plays out in its philosophy, but also this sense of thrownness in Dilthey. This whole sheet of paper appeared to be linguistic, right? So this is how we live in Dilthey within the level of understanding. What I do here is my pencil. I need my little pencil. Within the level of understanding. But this whole sheet of paper then was what is the humanities, what is historicality, what is linguisticality, and all of that. And in that's not just an anthropocentrism. That becomes it becomes a denial of the physicality of our being, right? The parts of our being which are not just at a level, the head level kind of understanding, at a level of language, right? And that's where situation, understanding, and interpretation. Now, the thing to understand about situation, understanding, and interpretation is all three of these. Three are aspects of understanding. Now that was just great. I just messed up the whole thing. Let's see if I can. I'm just going to try and shorten it and see if that. Okay, there I can. So all aspects of understanding in a different sense, in the broader sense of understanding, right? So this understanding is a moment of understanding within understanding generally. So hermeneutical understanding now, and this is where we're going ontological. See, we're not just doing epistemology now. This would be the other way of talking about this. This is all, since this is in the layer of understanding, this is all a level of epistemology, right? Situation, though, again, go back to being born. So obviously we have no conscious memory of any of this, but nonetheless, we are partly a function. We emerge, as we develop and are born. Slowly, whatever Dasein is, that level of organized complexity, which now requires for its description words which are not simply about biology, but are about existence in the sense of being, a conscious being, where we need other sorts of vocabulary. So you have situation is just that primordial way in which we find ourselves in the womb. As we're born, we're warm, we're cold, we're hungry, we're satisfied. All these ways in which we are placed unconsciously, in which it's easy to forget, just like with the meteor, unless there's a problem, right? So right now, we're all, hopefully, breathing comfortably without notice. But that breathing comfortably is a part of our connectedness. It's a part of our situation. And the role it's playing, it would become obvious if suddenly we weren't able to breathe comfortably, right? So suddenly there's some sort of, we have a heart attack, we're suffering a heart attack, and so suddenly we can't breathe in that sense. Or maybe there's a problem with the oxygen in the room, or there's a forest fire, so there's smoke suddenly coming in, and we can't breathe, and we would notice that. So like right now, the degree to which I can, I said this last time, feel the pressure on the bottom of my legs of this wood chair, right? The temperature of the room, the sound of birds outside my window, and the way all the sounds of nature are impacting my sense of where I am, or more to the point in this case, because my window is closed, the absence of any connection to anything else that's natural. The fact that I'm in a room, which despite the wood that I try and put in here and the view out the window, is largely made out of stuff that's inanimate. And for much of it, stuff that's so crushed out of recognition, you would have no idea what it was in nature. It's completely artificial. All of these sorts of things constitute our situation. And this is why I said we share a situation. We don't have the same situation, but a tree has a situation, right? A tree has more or less comfort in its world. If there's a fire, if there's drought, if there's rain, if there's sunshine, if there's cold, a tree in that sense is a mussel has a situation. And more sophisticated beings have situations also. It's just that they're easier not to see. So dogs and cats and dolphins have situations. I have a situation. The infant coming out of the womb has a situation overwhelmingly. The situation is always with us. It's that kind of most fundamental strata of awareness, of understanding. But again, it's a different way of being in the world than the being of a camcorder. At something of that level of sophistication, right? And so situations are a real part of understanding in the broadest sense. And when you think in terms of the emergence of being within being, you then don't leap straight to everything we've been talking about so far in the course before Heidegger, which is at the level of what he's going to have as interpretation, right? Where we are thinking and interpreting linguistically, right? And interpreting not just, so, I mean, of course I won't do it, but there's certain hand gestures I could do, right? Which are not words, but they can communicate quite strongly what I'm saying, right? If I were wearing, say I wasn't wearing a shirt, that I was just, just had on a t-shirt or no shirt at all. Suddenly you would realize, wait a second, this shirt is sending a message. And I'm not wearing a jacket and tie. That would send, so fashions, what we eat, turns of phrase, gestures, all of these things are at the realm of interpretation, where we react to. So that's where hermeneutics has been. But with Heidegger, suddenly there's awareness of this other level of cognizance, sentience, self-awareness. Sentience is not the word I wanted. Of being, although maybe it is. Maybe because there's the ability to feel pain and or pleasure. So now between these two is understanding, and understanding is, I mean, his famous example is understanding is hammering a nail and then finding the hammer to be heavy, or knowing how to hammer the nail. Or I decide I'm hungry. Do I decide I'm hungry, or I'm just suddenly aware I'm hungry, and I decide I'm going to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? I go out and make a peanut butter and jelly. I don't think peanut butter, jelly, knife, sandwich. I just go do it, right? Now that's different than simply being in a situation. That's now kind of engaging my world, but it's also not quite thinking explicitly at the level of interpretation. It's a way in which I engage things, and even the sense that the hammer is heavy, right? I don't understand the hammer being heavy because I know the definition of heavy, and I've weighed the hammer, right? My sense for the heaviness of the hammer, and it'll be a variable sense. It gets heavier as I use it, the hammer does. The longer you use a hammer, the heavier it gets in the realm of understanding, right? In the realm of interpretation, you would understand, no, it doesn't get heavier. It's the same weight. It's heavy. But what's happening, and you'd have an explanation for why it feels heavier, right? But what that feels is going to is this level of understanding, right? Which is just kind of our, and so it's our experience of the world. It's our way of interacting with the world. You can see how it kind of merges on the one hand, it seems to me, at least at this level of interpretation of Heidegger, with situation, and then on the other side it kind of merges into interpretation, where you're overtly thinking and interpreting out of these sorts of categories, right? So, but in terms of what we've been doing, everything we've been talking about for hermeneutics, especially when you talk about exegesis of text as hermeneutics, is in this level of interpretation. But when we think of understanding in the broadest sense, and so now this is where hermeneutics goes ontological, all three moments are in play. Situation, understanding, interpretation, the being there that we are, where we find ourselves thrown in all these senses, right, into some here and there, not others, from which we can project different futures and anticipate them, right? So once we understand all that, and how we're located in that way, from that perspective, the idea that we are going to have we're going to be able to achieve the modern project of epistemology, to find a God's eye view from where we can think universally and objectively, right, separated from all of this, that simply becomes unthinkable. And that's the way in which ontology, the shift to ontology, cuts off the route back that epistemology would want, right? So we are not going to have, although Ricoeur wants still, so here's where I will disagree with Ricoeur throughout these essays. He is committed to getting that epistemological element back in, even if it has to be qualified. I think after Heidegger, we're still going to be able to talk about degrees of surety. We'll get to this in Gadamer, but we're not going to get the sort of grounding of the epistemological project. And I think Ricoeur's desire for that is what makes him move to the text and delimit his hermeneutical explorations in order, by virtue of that delimiting, to be able to say things with certainty. But at that point, that's a delimiting that I think, that might be valid for interpretation theory, but hermeneutics, which is exercised, and kind of developed by Gadamer in the wake of Heidegger, hermeneutics has an ontological dimension. Situation, understanding, and interpretation all need to be in play. All right. So to speed up a little bit, because this is getting too long, ontological foundation versus epistemological grounding. So derive versus clarify. So again, you can understand all of this, how we find ourselves thrown within beings, that those implications of that for our knowledge, the contingency of existence, the various potential we have as beings towards death, and being aware of that, how our ability for interpretation makes us different than, say, a muscle, which has a situation and maybe rudimentary understanding, but certainly no interpretation. All this allows us to understand the character of Dasein, and no longer to be, going after the what and then having that who left as a remainder, because now we're thinking first from the who, and then unfolding what and how we can understand. But in that sense, there's a clarification here. So the derive here goes with epistemological grounding. The clarification goes with the ontological foundation. With Heidegger, there's a clarification and a remembering of the forgotten question of the being of being. This cuts off the possibility of imagining that we can think from some sort of disconnected, objective, universal, disengaged perspective and get absolute and certain knowledge. That dream is crushed, right? But actually we have more clarity, right? It doesn't turn out that at that point we were in a better situation to understand. It's just now we don't get understanding which is absolute and universal. But we saw better and worse understanding, and after Heidegger we have a better understanding of what it is to be the sorts of beings who live understandingly, right, as beings within reality, which really names the hermeneutical dimension of existence, which Gadamer is going to unfold. So the anticipatory character of being and the forehaving, I don't actually need to say a lot about that now, because I actually covered it above in projection. In particular for Heidegger, and this is true of existentialists in the early 20th century generally, death, and in particular realization of one's own impending death, right, is so significant for the way it individualizes you and gets you to take your temporality and the temporally limited character of your life seriously, right? So the forehaving would be very much related to what I said about, whether you anticipate having a week or if you anticipate having years and years and years. And of course this would pertain to all sorts of things that were less significant, but the significance of one's death is, for these existentialists, that's definitive. That's what can break you out of the herd, break you out of just living as people have told you to, break you up to a point where you say, wait a second, this is my one and only life, and it's vanishing, and I'm going to seize it now and make it my own. that becomes the ideal. That for Sartre, I mean, radically for Sartre, right? So Sartre imagines somehow that he can create stuff de novo. So this is where the hermeneutical understanding here um, takes apart Sartre's project from the foundations. But nonetheless, the notion of authenticity, kind of the contrary to the anxiety of influence that poets talk about, where what they want to do is create themselves, right? To create some, these unique, creative, not just novel but creative expressions. And the anxiety of influence is to find out that all you are is a product of prior causes. There's nothing original in a creative sense at all. So the anticipatory character of being, the forehaving, is about the way in which we live the present in light of our anticipation of the future, and in concretely, recognition of one's own death is seen as a highly significant event for kind of getting one to see the significance of one's life. It's probably not an accident. Heidegger was a German soldier in World War One. And he is, so he's in a context in which death has been something that's been impending and real for many of his classmates and friends. And I don't know a specific service. I think actually he did weather calculations for the balloons that carried the poisons for the gas warfare stuff. So that would be interesting to kind of reflect on some. But maybe he had points where his own death was really there. It's kind of a cliche, of course. The person gets the terminal diagnosis or has the near-death encounter. It just transforms how they see their life. The existentialists are kind of, this is how they're unpacking why that's the case. It's because suddenly the forehaving becomes explicit, and you realize that you've been living into some imaginarily infinitely open future, which has not brought home to you the urgency of seizing whatever gift of present life you have. All right. One other thing I want to add, going back, that as he unpacks the character of Dasein, one of the fundamental things he says is that we live with concern or with care for our being, moving through existence. So it's part of the fundamental structure of Dasein to be full of care for ourselves as we move forward. So that's another thing I wanted to add about that that's significant. Okay, I need to make a correction here. So this should not be saying, speaking, and then saying, hearing. It should be saying, speaking, and then hearing, keeping silent. Saying is in relationship to speaking, or what he'll later talk to about speech, which of course has lapses into the empirical, and that's opposed not to saying, keeping silent, but to hearing, keeping silent. Where first linguistically one hears, and so that's a silence out of which one hears, and only then does one speak. But then there's also this contrast between saying and speaking. And so the hearing, keeping silent, I believe what this speaks to is the fact that we at first have situation and understanding, that we are a projection that's thrown already, right? We find ourselves, we emerge from the first already thrown. This is a sense in which he says the difference between Heidegger and Sartre is that already. And that's what I was referring to earlier when I said Sartre wants to imagine a kind of self-creation ex nihilo, which is unthinkable because we already find ourselves thrown in emerging understandingly out of a situation and understanding. By the time we're at the level of interpretation, we've already been hugely formed by the character of our thrownness into a particular situation with particular understanding and interpretation. So now again, you can speak out of that, but I think this is where the saying and the speaking. So the speaking is about the meaning of words, or when he says it lapses into the empirical, where to understand the words is to be able to relate them to the empirical realm or to other words. That's where it would include semiology. Whereas the saying, he says, refers back to the things said. I find this very confusing, frankly, and I'm not sure if it's me. I think it might be Ricoeur. Let me do this in the way that Levinas appropriates it. Now, Levinas is a Jew who lost his entire immediate family to the Holocaust. Both names Heidegger as one of the five most significant philosophers in Western history, but also, since Heidegger proved to be, an enthusiastic for a long period Nazi, who abandoned his friends, who just was not just a silent member. He was an active Nazi. So Levinas doesn't mention Heidegger unless he needs to, but I think when he does his saying, said stuff, it does fit with this, and fit with what I think Ricoeur wants to be saying. Let me explain it in terms of a prayer. So let's say I often open my classes with this certain prayer. Now you can understand what all the words in the prayer mean, even theologically, the words that refer to God and heart and all these sorts of things. All those words have meanings that can be referred to other meanings, which connect to a history of meaning. I mean, that would be the semiotics. Maybe even relate to things in the world. It could be semantics, so not just the realm within the meanings within the web of language, but the meanings as the language is related to the non-linguistic world. But this is a reference to the material world, and there's a degree to which all of that would be speaking and speech. But if you heard and understood the prayer in just that way, just in terms of interpretation and meanings at the level of interpretation, then following Levinas's understanding of what's going on here, you would have missed the saying of the prayer, which goes deeper into the spirituality, maybe to some degree in the sense of situation understanding of the meaningfulness of what's being said. Anyway, I think I'm not going to edit. I was going to edit this, trying to come up with something clearer, but every time I go to this, I stumble over it. And when we get to Levinas, I'm going to be able to say what this means much more clearly. And I'm just not sure. And he makes a reference to later Heidegger here and the language, but I'm not sure exactly that that's going to help. So I'm just going to stop with that and move on. This gives us the aporia, which has already become visible, of ontology but epistemology. And I think at this point, this is more of a Ricoeur's aporia. As he says, Heidegger doesn't sense this aporia. But it might be visible in Gadamer. We'll get to that. But this is where Ricoeur still wants the epistemology. He still wants a moment for critique in the sense of critical, in the sense of Kant's critique of pure reason, in terms of the modern philosophical epistemology as first philosophy expectation for knowledge which we can know is true, or if it's not true, we can have a reference point to say, the probability of its truth. But we still have this ideal of objective universal knowledge. That ideal is just gone after Heidegger. I don't think it's possible. So I've made some cuts here because I'm not happy with what I've been saying. But in the end, for reasons that I will not try to detail after all at this point, I don't think the return route is possible, and I think that's an ambition that Ricoeur simply needs to lose. I fear some people like Ricoeur, and they combine Ricoeur and his focus on the text with a sacred text, and so they combine Ricoeur with scripture, and then that becomes given, and the way Ricoeur talks, that gives you an illusion that if you're following scripture, you're doing something which meets criteria for knowledge in the modern sense. The problem is, at that point, you've not answered the question, what makes you think that scripture is true, whichever scriptures you happen to be using. Ricoeur has no way to answer that question. And I think we need to figure out, we need to name that, honestly. Okay, I'm going to stop with that.